In the small village of La Mancha, long before windmills became giants in a neighboring hidalgo's imagination, lived Sancho Panza, a man simple in appearance, but possessed of rustic wisdom that amazed those who took the time to listen to him. Contrary to what history would later remember, Sancho was not simply a naive peasant attracted by promises of adventure. He was, in his own way, a keen observer of human nature and a philosopher of the fields. Each morning, leading his donkey toward the barley fields, Sancho observed the subtle changes in the village. He saw how new fashions from the court transformed minds, how books of knight-errantry, those cheap novels sold by peddlers, inflamed the imagination of young people, and sometimes even their elders. He had himself leafed through some of these works at the barber's, not out of taste for adventure, but from curiosity about what could so captivate his contemporaries. What distinguished Sancho was his ability to see through illusions, without despising those who indulged in them. When he heard the village youth passionately debating the exploits of Amadis of Gaul or the impossible loves of Florismart, he smiled indulgently. He understood that these stories answered a deep need for wonder in often monotonous lives. But he also knew how to distinguish dream from reality. One day, the miller's son came to find him in the fields, a wooden sword at his belt, and his head full of chivalrous plans. "Sancho," he said, "don't you see that we're wasting our time here, while others cover their names with glory? The roads are full of opportunities to prove our worth." Sancho set down his hoe and sat in the shade of an olive tree. "Tell me, Miguel, who feeds the heroes when they're on their quests for adventure?" The young man was perplexed. "Well, inns, castles. And who grows the wheat for the bread in the inns? Who raises the pigs for the feasts in the castles?" Sancho picked a barley ear and examined its grains.
"Every grain counts, my boy. The heroes in your books eat well because somewhere, a man like me has sown, weeded, harvested." Years passed, and Sancho developed what he called to himself the art of useful patience. He had learned to listen to others talk about their grand projects, their impossible dreams, without ever brutally discouraging them, but by slipping in here and there a practical question, a down-to-earth observation that sometimes led them to reflect. This method had earned him a reputation as a wise man in the village, though he denied any pretension to wisdom.
When Alonso Quijano began to show the first signs of what the village would soon consider an obsession with books of chivalry, Sancho was among the first to notice. He observed this 50-year-old gentleman who gradually neglected the management of his lands to spend entire days immersed in his novels. Unlike the other villagers who began to snicker, Sancho felt a kind of compassion mixed with curiosity for this man who was clearly seeking to escape a reality he deemed insufficient. One summer evening, as Sancho was returning from the fields, he encountered Alonso Quijano wandering in the village lanes, wild-eyed, and talking to himself about enchanted castles and captive princesses. Instead of avoiding him, as most inhabitants would have done, Sancho approached. "Good evening, Señor Quijano. It's a beautiful evening for a walk." The hidalgo stopped and looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. "Ah, good man! Don't you see that the times need heroes? That the world is sinking into mediocrity while we remain idle?" Sancho nodded thoughtfully. "It's true that the world has its flaws, sir, but tell me, have you ever tried to right a wrong in your own village before setting off to correct those of the entire world?" Quijano stared at him intently. "What do you mean?" "Well, the widow Martinez can no longer maintain her plot since her husband died. Her children are hungry. Wouldn't that be a first dragon to fight?" The hidalgo seemed troubled for a moment. Then his face lit up. You're right. But that requires method, organization. A knight-errant cannot act alone in such missions. Thus began between them a strange friendship. Sancho understood that Alonso Quijano needed his chivalrous dreams to give meaning to his life, but he also saw in him a generous man, capable of true compassion despite his fantasies. For his part, the Hidalgo found in Sancho a listener who did not mock his ideals, even if he sometimes tempered them with practical considerations. Over the months, Sancho became the unofficial confidant of the man who was already preparing to become Don Quixote.
He discreetly helped him put his affairs in order, ensured that his lands would not suffer too much from his absence, and above all, he reflected on the best way to accompany this man he saw departing for an adventure from which he might not return unscathed. For Sancho had made his decision. Not out of greed or naivety, as those who would later tell their story would think, but out of a form of philosophical loyalty to a man who, despite his apparent madness, embodied a generosity and idealism that the modern world seemed to have lost. Sancho knew he couldn't prevent his friend from setting out on adventures, but he could at least ensure that he didn't go alone.
Thus, when Don Quixote de la Mancha finally mounted Rocinante and proposed that Sancho become his squire, the latter accepted, not as a credulous peasant attracted by the promise of an island to govern, but as a mature man who had chosen to put his wisdom at the service of a friend's sublime madness. He knew that windmills would remain windmills, that inns would never be castles, and that the beautiful Aldonza Lorenzo would never truly become the lady Dulcinea del Toboso. But he also knew that sometimes accompanying someone in their dreams can be nobler than letting them dream alone. And that is why, if one looks closely, Sancho Panza was never truly fooled by the adventures they lived together. His laughter, his protests, his down-to-earth proverbs were not manifestations of simple-mindedness, but the tools of an intelligent man who had understood that his role was not to cure Don Quixote of his dreams, but to prevent him from being completely lost in them. In this, Sancho Panza was perhaps the wiser of the two companions, and certainly the most loyal.